They boarded first class just like their ticket said, but the pilot stared at them, cold and silent, then ordered them to move to the back of the plane without a reason. No one defended them, not even the crew. But 6 minutes later, everything changed. The pilot was dragged off the flight, and every passenger who stayed silent was forced to watch what came next. Stay with this video because what this mother uncovers next will leave you stunned. And the truth, it was hidden in plain sight all along. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new story like this one. The boarding process had just begun when an older black couple stepped quietly into the first-class cabin. The man, Harold Jenkins, wore a soft navy sweater over a collared shirt. His shoes polished, his glasses resting low on his nose. His wife, Doreen, followed just behind him, dressed in a long beige coat with a silk scarf neatly tied at her neck. They moved calmly, their pace unhurried, like people who had earned the right to take up space without asking for permission. They found their seats 2C and 2D and began settling in. Harold adjusted the window shade, while Doreen gently slid her purse under the seat in front of her. This trip wasn't for business or some luxury getaway. It was for something far more personal. Their youngest daughter had just been promoted to director at a publishing firm, and she was hosting a small family dinner in Boston. It had taken years of hard work and long hours for her to get there, and Harold and Doreen wouldn't have missed it for the world. Their daughter had even insisted they fly first class as a gift. It wasn't something they usually did. But she had said, "You two deserve it for everything." So they accepted, humbly, quietly. Doreen pulled out a crossword puzzle from her bag. Harold reached for the seat belt and clicked it into place. The cabin around them bustled softly, flight attendants, offering drinks, passengers stowing bags. The usual sounds before takeoff. Nothing seemed out of place. Until the cockpit door opened, the pilot stepped out. His name was Captain Riley, and he had flown for the airline nearly 20 years. He was tall, clean-shaven, with gray hair combed precisely and a uniform pressed so stiff it looked like it had never been worn. He didn't smile, he didn't glance at anyone else. His eyes locked on Harold and Doreen like he had been waiting for them. He walked over without a word of greeting. "I need to see your boarding passes," he said flatly. Doreen looked up confused. "We already gave them at the gate." Riley didn't blink. "I need to see them again. These seats are reserved for first-class passengers." Harold, still calm, reached into his sweater pocket and handed over both passes. Riley barely glanced at them. He didn't scan the QR codes, didn't check the names, just stared at them for a beat, then shook his head. "You'll need to move," he said. "These aren't your seats." Doreen's brow furrowed. "Sir, they are. We booked them weeks ago. Our daughter, I'm not asking again." Riley cut her off louder now. "Either you move to coach or this flight doesn't leave." The cabin went still. A man in 1B lowered his phone. A woman 2 rows up slowly turned her head, then looked away just as quickly. No one spoke. No one offered help. No flight attendant stepped forward. They all heard what was said, but acted like they didn't. Harold stood up slowly. His face didn't show outrage, only quiet resolve. Doreen rose too gently, placing her scarf back around her neck. She held his arm steady but shaken. Not a word came from anyone else in the cabin as they walked past the rows of silent passengers. Their seats 2C and 2D remained empty, but nobody moved to sit in them. Nobody dared. Harold and Doreen found 2 empty seats near the back of the planter row, 27 by the engine hum. The overhead bins were already packed, so Harold had to hold their small carry-on on his lap. Doreen sat by the window staring outside without really seeing anything. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and she hadn't said a word since they were forced to move. Harold could feel her frustration, even though she didn't show it. She wasn't the kind of woman who cried easily, but she carried hurt in quiet ways. Her silence, her posture, the way she blinked too often. Harold took out his phone and tapped out a message with steady fingers. He didn't write much. "Just the facts. Pilot made us leave first class. Said we didn't belong. No explanation. We're in row 27 now." He sent it to Elena, their daughter. A minute later, his phone buzzed. What then?" Another message. "Stay where you are? He'll handle it." Harold read her words and exhaled slowly. He tucked the phone back into his pocket and glanced at Doreen, who was still staring outside, her lips pressed together. He reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. She didn't look at him, but her fingers curled around his. Up in the front of the plane, Captain Riley stepped back into the cockpit with a look of satisfaction on his face. He muttered something under his breath as he sat back down in his seat and adjusted his headset. The co-pilot, a younger man named Jeremy, glanced at him sideways. "You sure about that?" Jeremy asked, cautious. Riley shrugged. "We're not flying with people who don't know their place. I'm not about to argue with the booking system." Jeremy didn't answer. He had seen the boarding passes too, clearly marked first class, but he knew better than to challenge Riley mid-flight. It wasn't worth the backlash. Meanwhile, in seat 27, Doreen finally turned toward Harold. "You think she'll make a scene?" She asked, her voice low. Harold shook his head once. She won't need to. She knows who to call. And she did. Elena wasn't just a director at a publishing house. What Riley didn't know, what none of the crew knew, was that Elena's husband, Gregory Shaw, sat on the board of directors for the airline. And Elena had already picked up the phone back in row 27. The cabin noise rose again as passengers finished boarding. A flight attendant walked down the aisle offering pre-takeoff checks. She gave Harold and Doreen a short glance, then moved on without a word. No water, no apology, nothing. Doreen reached up and adjusted the small air nozzle above her seat. It hissed quietly, but the air felt stale. Her shoulders were tense. Her chest ached, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper. That sharp ache of knowing you've been seen. Not for who you are, but for who someone decided you must be. "I should have said something," she murmured. "I should have made him explain it in front of everyone." "You didn't know him anything," Harold replied quietly. "I know," she said. "But I still wanted to." Harold leaned back. "Let Elena speak for us." "Now," Doreen gave a dry smile. "Oh, she will?" Meanwhile, Elena's phone was pressed tightly to her ear. She had locked herself inside her office and was speaking to Marcy Geller, the airline's director of flight operations. Marcy had worked with Gregory before. She also knew Elena was the type to exaggerate. Elena's voice was steady, but underneath the surface was fire. "My parents were in their assigned first-class seats. The pilot personally removed them without cause. If you're going to tell me that's not a problem, then say it plainly, because I promise you I won't be quiet." Marcy didn't try to defend anyone. "Give me the flight number." Elena had it memorized. 4673 Boston to JFK, scheduled to depart 12 minutes ago. "Got it," Marcy said. "We'll call the aircraft now." Elena lowered the phone slowly. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage. Her parents didn't talk much about the way the world had treated them, but she knew she had seen the way clerks looked past them in stores. She remembered the time a neighbor had asked if Harold was their gardener. She had watched it all, and this time she had power. She wasn't going to waste it. In the cockpit, the radio crackled. "Flight 4673, come in." Captain Riley responded, voice calm. "Go ahead, this is executive operations. We need you to hold the plane on the tarmac." "There's an internal security issue we need to verify," Riley frowned. "Everything's secure here?" "You'll be informed shortly," the voice replied. "Hold position." He clicked the radio off and muttered, "Damn corporate politics." He looked over at Jeremy, who had stiffened. "What's this about?" Jeremy asked. Riley waved him off. Probably a late luggage issue or some paperwork mistake. But Jeremy wasn't convinced. He had flown enough times to know what security delay really meant. Riley's confidence began to shift. His voice wasn't as firm when he picked up the in-flight phone and told the flight attendants, "There's going to be a short delay. Tell the passengers to remain seated." In Coach Harold felt the plane stop moving. He looked over at Doreen. "They've been told to hold the plane," he said softly. She raised her eyebrows. "Already," Harold nodded, voice just above a whisper. "Something tells me Captain Riley's about to have a very long day," and indeed he was. Because this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't a small customer complaint. This was something the airline couldn't ignore, and someone far above his rank was about to make that very clear. The flight crew tried to maintain a sense of normalcy as the plane sat motionless on the runway. Passengers began shifting in their seats, some glancing at their watches, others pulling off headphones and murmuring to each other. A woman in seat 3. A leaned toward her husband. "We were supposed to take off 10 minutes ago." Did they say why we're still here? Her husband shook his head. Just that, it's a security hold. Whatever that means. In the back of the plane, Harold quietly unwrapped a peppermint and handed it to Doreen like he always did during takeoffs. She took it with a small smile, but her face still carried that same weight. She wasn't angry in the explosive sense, but something about being silenced in plain sight stayed with you, especially when everyone around you pretended it wasn't happening. Meanwhile, up in the airline's central control office, Marcy Geller had looped in another voice to the call. Gregory Shaw. He had just finished a board meeting when Elena called him. One look at his wife's face, and he didn't ask questions. Now he sat in his own conference room with the door locked, tie slightly loosened, laptop open. He stared at the flight details on the screen. You're absolutely certain this was the captain? He asked Marcy, voice low but firm. Yes, she replied, the passenger report and Elena's call match. And we just confirmed through gate logs. Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins were ticketed and cleared for first class. Assigned seats. No issues flagged by the system. Gregory ran a hand over his jaw. Then what happened was personal, not procedural. Marcy hesitated. You want me to pull the captain off the flight now? Gregory didn't blink. Yes, and do it in front of passengers. Let him feel what it's like to be questioned publicly. He didn't think twice before humiliating those people. He doesn't get to hide behind protocol. Now understood, she said, already typing instructions to ground operations. Back on the plane, Riley stood near the cockpit door, chewing at the inside of his cheek. He had gotten quiet since the delay began. Something didn't feel right. He was a man who trusted control, and when things slipped out of his hands, his mood soured fast. Jeremy was watching him now, closer than before. You sure you want to just stand there? He asked carefully. They didn't give us a time for how long. Well, be grounded. Riley didn't answer. He was trying to act unfazed, but the pressure had started to build. Every minute the plane stayed still, his sense of command shrank a little more. Then came the knock, a quick, firm series of raps on the cockpit door. The lead flight attendant, Cheryl, opened it slightly and stepped inside. Captain, she said, eyes flicking briefly toward Jeremy. There's someone from airport security at the front. He says he needs to speak with you. Now Riley's brow furrowed. Security for what? Cheryl didn't respond. She simply held the door open. Passengers near. The front watched as a tall man in a black airport security uniform stepped onto the plane. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself to the crew. He simply looked at Riley and asked one question. Are you Captain Riley? Yes, Riley said slowly. You'll need to step off the aircraft immediately. You've been removed from duty. Gasps rippled through the cabin. One man actually turned in his seat to get a better look. A teenage girl across the aisle took off her earbuds. Frozen, Riley stiffened. Excuse me? The officer's voice didn't change. This is a direct order from airline executive control. Please gather your things, passengers began whispering. The tension spread like wildfire. Riley looked around the cabin as if searching for someone to defend him. But no one stood up. No one spoke on his behalf. The same silence he had once used against Harold and Doreen now circled him like a rope tightening. Cheryl stepped aside, letting the officer through. Riley's mouth twitched. For a second he looked like he might refuse. But then, realizing the uniform and the authority behind it, he nodded stiffly and walked out of the cockpit. Down in row 27, Harold sat up straighter. Doreen noticed it first, is that Harold followed her gaze and saw Captain Riley walking up the aisle. Not with the brisk, commanding walk he had earlier. Now his steps were slower, heavy. The kind of walk that tried to carry pride when there was nothing left to hold. The passengers didn't clap. They didn't cheer, but they watched, and that was worse. Every step Riley took was under a spotlight of silence. As he passed row 27, he didn't make eye contact with Harold, but Harold did, and he didn't look away. That look said everything. You thought we didn't belong. Turns out you didn't. The plane remained still on the tarmac as passengers shifted in their seats, their voices low and cautious. A woman 2 rows behind first class leaned toward her partner and whispered, "Was that really the pilot they just removed?" Her partner nodded slowly, still stunned. Security took him. I've never seen that before. Not on a flight. The flight attendants moved with unusual stiffness now. No one explained what had just happened, and maybe they didn't know how, but everyone sensed the shift. The man who had once held complete control of the aircraft had just been walked off like an unqualified passenger who tried to slip past the gate. And the reason no one knew for sure. But word travels fast even in silence. In the back of the plane, Harold sat quietly, arms folded. He hadn't spoken since Riley passed him. Not out of smugness. He wasn't that kind of man, but because something had settled inside him. Something hard to name. It wasn't revenge, and it wasn't peace. It was a strange stillness, like watching a door finally close that had been open for too long. Doreen reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. She didn't write in it, but just held it in her lap the way she always did when her thoughts felt too big to carry around in her head. She didn't speak either, but her expression had changed. Her chin was lifted, her back straightened, her presence, even seated near the very back of the plane, began to feel bigger. At the front of the cabin, Cheryl picked up the intercom with trembling fingers. It wasn't often that a flight leader had to address a full cabin after a pilot had been removed in front of passengers. She cleared her throat gently. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've had a brief change in flight command. Another pilot will be boarding shortly and, well, be on our way soon. We apologize for the delay." She said nothing more. The speaker clicked off and the cabin remained hushed. Less than 2 minutes later, the new pilot arrived. A woman this time, Captain Dana Reeves, with a calm presence and a professional smile that didn't feel forced. She greeted Cheryl first, then walked straight into the cockpit. No show, no dramatics. She knew what she was stepping into and didn't waste time pretending otherwise. Back in row 27, Doreen finally spoke. "I wonder if the new captain even knows what just happened." Harold glanced toward the front. "I think she knows enough, and that's what matters." He picked up his phone, noticing a text from Elena Hess off the plane. "I got confirmation from Gregor you're staying right where you are for now, but someone's coming to you soon." Harold read the message twice, then turned the screen so Doreen could see. "She says someone's coming." Doreen narrowed her eyes. "Who?" Harold shrugged. "Doesn't say." But before they had time to wonder, the curtain between first class and coach pulled back. A tall man in a gray blazer and dark slacks walked past the rows, slowly scanning seat numbers. His hair was closely cropped and he carried himself with quiet authority. He stopped beside row 27. "Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins," Doreen turned slightly unsure. "Yes," Harold answered. The man gave a polite nod. "Im from Flight Operations. I'd like to escort you back to your original seats in first class." Whispers exploded behind them. A teenager pulled out her phone, already recording. A man across the aisle sat up straighter. Another woman stared openly, her mouth slightly open. Doreen blinked. Why now? The man didn't break eye contact. Because the mistake has been corrected, and you shouldn't have been moved in the first place. He said it plainly, not a suggestion, not a request, but a quiet correction that everyone around them heard. Harold stood slow and steady. He turned to Doreen, extended his hand. She took it and stood beside him. She didn't smile, but her eyes had something in them. A clear, sharp steadiness. As they began walking toward the front again, the cabin went quiet. Heads turned, eyes followed. Some of the same passengers who had avoided looking at them earlier now couldn't look away, but the walk wasn't about being seen. It wasn't about reclaiming the seat. It was about reclaiming what should never been taken. As they reached first class, Cheryl met them with an embarrassed look and a soft voice. "Your seats have been cleaned and reset, and if there's anything else you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to let me know." Harold nodded once Doreen simply said thank you. Then they sat. Not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with dignity. The kind that doesn't ask for permission, the kind that refuses to be reduced, the kind that once seen can't be unseen. As Harold and Doreen settled back into their first-class seats, the cabin atmosphere was completely different from when they first boarded. The quiet murmurs, the subtle glances, the awkward silence from other passengers, all of it now felt loaded with a new weight. The same passengers who had looked through them earlier now struggled to look them in the eye. Some turned away quickly, pretending to read. Others kept stealing quick glances as if trying to read the situation or perhaps their own guilt. A man seated diagonally across the aisle, wearing a tailored suit and gold cufflinks, cleared his throat softly and leaned forward slightly. "I saw what happened," he said, not quite making eye contact. "It wasn't right. Just wanted to say that Harold didn't respond right away." He turned his head and studied the man for a second. "Then why didn't you say that earlier?" Harold asked, calm but direct. The man blinked, taken off guard. "I didn't know what was going on." "You knew enough," Doreen added quietly, not even looking at him. The man nodded and leaned back into his seat. Silence, not insulted. Just forced to sit with the truth. Cheryl, the lead flight attendant, returned moments later with a tray holding 2 glasses of sparkling water and a small dish of warm nuts. "These are complimentary," she said softly. "We're very sorry for earlier." Doreen offered a polite nod but didn't touch the glass. "Did you offer these when we first sat here?" she asked. Cheryl hesitated. "No, Mom. I didn't get the chance." "Or maybe you just didn't try." Doreen said, not unkind, not rude, just honest. The flight attendant didn't argue. She simply nodded, bowed her head slightly, and walked away. Harold finally reached for his glass and took a sip, his hands now steady. He pulled out his phone and saw another message from Elena. "Hell be permanently suspended. The board has already voted. Greg called me from the meeting room. They're not waiting." He passed the phone to Doreen. Her eyes scanned the message and a soft breath escaped her lips. Not relief exactly, but something close to closure. "Has done," Harold said. "Won't fly for this airline again." Doreen didn't celebrate. Instead, she looked down at her lap. "Good," she said softly. "But it won't be the last time it happens to someone." "No," Harold replied. "But maybe next time they'll remember this moment." The truth was, they hadn't asked for anyone to be fired. They hadn't marched onto the plane, demanding special treatment. They had simply wanted to take the seats they paid for and enjoy a flight in peace. But for some people, peace comes with conditions. For some people, dignity has to be earned again and again, seat by seat, stair by stair. Back in the galley, Cheryl leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples. Her fellow crew member, Allie Younger, and still new to first-class routes, approached carefully. "Is it true," she whispered, "that the pilot got removed because of that couple?" Cheryl nodded. "It's true. They were in the right. He forced them out without even checking properly." Alice's brows furrowed. I thought they were just asked to move because of an overbooking." "No," Cheryl said. "He didn't like how they looked sitting up front." "That's all it took." Allie looked out past the curtain. "I feel awful. I didn't say anything." "Neither did I," Cheryl said. "And we're the ones who should have." There was a pause. Then Allie asked, "Are we going to be in trouble too?" Cheryl didn't answer. She wasn't sure, because the truth was, silence had consequences too. In the cockpit, Captain Dana Reeves was reviewing the flight plan. She had been briefed before boarding, but had said nothing to the passengers or the crew that wasn't her place, not yet. But she had read the report filed by Executive Command, and she had read it twice. She glanced at the digital manifest in front of her, then looked at the co-pilot who had remained behind. "Jeremy, you were here when it happened." He nodded once stiffly. "You say anything?" she asked. Jeremy hesitated. "No, I didn't know how to handle it." "Wasn't your job to handle him," Dana said. "But it was your job to tell someone. Silence makes you part of it." Jeremy's shoulders dropped a little. He knew she was right. Dana stared at the flight path once more and leaned back. "You've flown for 18 years, she said, "long enough to know how things work up here and how people like that get away with it." She didn't say Riley's name. She didn't need to. "But not this time," she added. In the cabin, as the final preparations for takeoff resumed, Doreen reached into her purse and took out her notebook again. This time she opened it and wrote something down. Harold noticed and smiled softly. "What are you writing?" She looked up at him. "Just a reminder," she said, "of how silence can be louder than a voice, and how power only changes when someone dares to use theirs." He looked out the window as the plane began to roll forward. Neither of them wanted this kind of attention, but now that it had come, they weren't going to pretend it hadn't happened. They would carry it with them, not with bitterness, but with clarity. And maybe someone else on that flight would too. The plane was finally airborne. A smooth ascent, no turbulence. The captain's voice came over the intercom briefly with a professional tone. We've reached cruising altitude. Sit back, relax, and thank you again for your patience. The announcement was standard, but the mood inside the cabin was anything but. In first class, things were quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that followed an event people didn't want to discuss, but couldn't stop thinking about. The passengers, most of whom had said nothing during the confrontation, now found themselves watching Harold and Doreen with cautious eyes. Not out of hostility, but something closer to shame. Some stared at the ceiling. Some kept pretending to read. Others simply sat with the weight of what they had witnessed and chosen to ignore. Doreen opened her tray table and slowly peeled back the foil on the meal that had just been served. She wasn't hungry, but eating gave her something to do with her hands. Harold didn't touch his food. He simply sat back watching the clouds drift by. After a while, one of the flight attendants returned. Allie, the younger one who had spoken with Cheryl earlier. Her posture was careful, almost unsure. She stopped at their row and cleared her throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins," she began, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, I should have said something earlier when everything happened. I didn't, I froze. And I want you to know that I see it now." Doreen looked up. She studied the young woman's face, noting the nervousness in her eyes. "Thank you," she said calmly. "It takes something to say that, especially after the fact. I know it doesn't fix anything." Allie added quickly, "I just didn't want you to think no one noticed, or that we didn't care." Harold gave her a polite nod. "Noted," he said, and appreciated. Allie smiled faintly and left, but the tension didn't fully disappear. Across the aisle, the man in the tailored suit who had fumbled an apology earlier finally stood and stepped into the aisle. He walked slowly over to their seats, his hands clasped in front of him. "I owe you both more than what I said earlier," he began. "My name is Douglas Merrow. I'm a partner at a law firm in Chicago, and when I saw what happened, I knew it was wrong. But I didn't say anything because, well, to be honest, I didn't want to be part of a scene." Harold raised his eyebrows slightly. "You thought staying quiet was safer?" Douglas hesitated. "Yes, but the truth is, silence was part of the scene. I just didn't see it until you looked at me." Doreen nodded slowly. "That's the trouble with silence. It pretends to be neutral, that it isn't." He paused, him not asking for forgiveness. "But if you ever feel like sharing your story publicly, what happened here, I'd be glad to support it in any way I can. Legally, financially." Whatever's needed. Harold and Doreen exchanged a brief glance. "We're not interested in headlines," Harold said. "We're interested in systems changing." Douglas nodded. "Understood. But just know some of us are listening now. Even if we didn't speak up when it counted." He returned to his seat. A few more passengers glanced over clearly. Eavesdropping, not one of them said a word, but something had shifted. The shame in the cabin had begun to turn inward. Back in the galley, Cheryl leaned against the wall, drinking a glass of water she hadn't asked for. Her hands were still shaking a little. She couldn't stop thinking about the moment the couple had walked off the plane and then returned. The look in their eyes, the silence that wrapped around her like a mirror. She turned to Allie. "I've been doing this job almost 14 years, she said softly. Allie looked up. "Have you ever seen a pilot get pulled off mid-flight before takeoff?" Cheryl shook her head. "Not once." Allie hesitated. "Do you think we're next?" For staying quiet, Cheryl didn't answer right away. She looked toward the curtain that separated them from the first-class cabin. "I think we all need to ask ourselves why we stayed quiet in the first place." Allie nodded slowly. It wasn't just him who failed them. No, Cheryl said it wasn't somewhere over Pennsylvania. The plane continued its quiet journey east. But inside the cabin, the flight wasn't quiet anymore. Not in people's minds. Harold pulled out his phone again. Another message had come in from Elena. "Greg just called. There's press starting to ask questions. Apparently a few passengers are already tweeting." Someone recorded Riley getting escorted off. He turned the phone to show Doreen. She read it inside. "I knew someone had a phone out," she said. "They always do." "Do you want this out there?" Harold asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to forget it happened. But the other part—" She looked up at the row in front of her, where no one had said a word when they were being forced out of their seats. "That part wants them to be reminded, not just today, but every time they step on a plane. Harold nodded slowly. Then maybe this isn't over. And it wasn't. The seatbelt sign had been off for a while now, but no one seemed eager to move around. Even the usual rhythm of a mid-flight stretch felt different, like the cabin had absorbed all the unease from earlier and couldn't quite let it go. There were no loud conversations, no business calls on mute, no tinkling laughs over complimentary wine. It was a cabin full of people sitting with themselves unsure of what to say, or if they even had the right to say anything. Harold reclined slightly in his seat, his eyes fixed on the back of the seat in front of him, but it was clear he wasn't really looking at it. He was thinking, more than that he was remembering. Because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. It was just the first time it had happened so publicly and to someone who thought they were past all that he could still remember, being passed over for a promotion in '94. He'd trained the guy who got the job, a handshake, a smile, and an excuse that had sounded reasonable enough. He could remember being followed around in stores, being asked, "Are you sure this card will go through at restaurants?" He never exploded. He never made a scene. He always told himself, be better. Don't give them a reason to see what they already think. But this time he hadn't said a word, and still he had been made to leave his seat. Beside him, Doreen was flipping slowly through the in-flight magazine, but her fingers were idle. The pages turned, but she didn't see the words. Her thoughts, like Harold's, were moving through years. Her entire life people had smiled while making her small. Even now in her 60s, she still got that look from hotel clerks who assumed she must be the help when she walked through the lobby of a nice hotel. Still had to answer questions like, "Oh, are you in the right line at the airport?" even while wearing a gold bracelet that cost more than most people's luggage. And now that same insult had come from a man with wings on his chest, an authority in his walk, acting like she and Harold had wandered into a place they didn't belong. She closed the magazine with a snap. Her voice was quiet but clear. "We paid for those seats. We arrived on time. We were polite and none of it mattered." Harold didn't respond right away. "You think people on this flight learned something?" she asked. He shrugged slightly. "Some, maybe others will forget by landing a few rows behind them." Douglas, the suited man from earlier, was typing something on his phone. He paused, looked over at them again, then typed more. When the plane landed, his tweet would go viral. It would read, "Just witnessed a pilot forcibly remove an older black couple from first class without reason. Security escorted him off 30 minutes later. The couple handled it with more dignity than anyone else on this flight. Shame on us for staying silent." Flight 4673. Do better elsewhere on the plane, a young woman in economy had also started typing. She hadn't said anything when it happened. She was rows back and had only caught the end of it, but she had seen the couples return to first class. The way the man looked forward with calm strength, the way the woman held herself like someone who refused to be shrunk. She didn't know their names, but something about them stayed with her. Her post said, "Just saw the most graceful act of quiet power. They tried to erase this couple, and instead they made everyone else visible." You ever see someone walk back to a seat like they own the air around them? That's what I saw today. The ripples were starting. Quiet, yes, but steady. In the cockpit, Captain Dana Reeves checked the flight dashboard and quietly jotted a few notes in the incident logbook. She'd flown 1,000 hours, she'd dealt with turbulence, missed connections, even a drunk senator once. But this was different. She'd walked onto a plane mid-scandal and watched an entire cabin turn into a courtroom without a single word of due process. She hadn't said much when she took the seat. She didn't need to, but she'd heard enough through the crew to know that what happened wasn't just procedural. It was personal. Jeremy, still sitting in the co-pilot's chair, finally spoke after what felt like hours. "Captain," she turned slightly, "I think I should file a report too. About what I saw, Dana studied him. She had expected him to avoid it. To do what most young pilots did when faced with internal drama, stay quiet, ride the flight out. But this one was different. You should," she said, "and this time, don't soften the truth." He nodded back in the cabin. Cheryl walked past Harold and Doreen's row again. She didn't stop this time. She couldn't. Every time she looked at them, something twisted in her stomach. Not because they looked at her with resentment. They didn't. They barely acknowledged her at all, and maybe that was worse. She thought about the moment they were asked to move, how she'd stood just 5 feet away and said nothing. Not because she agreed with the captain, but because she didn't want to jeopardize her years of spotless performance, didn't want to be the one who challenged command. But now that spotless record felt like a lie, like a line of silence she had chosen again and again. She stepped into the galley and leaned on the wall, her hands shaking slightly as she filled out a crew report form. Incident summary. Failure to intervene. Flight leader witnessed discrimination, but did not act. Acknowledging fault. Requesting inclusion, informal debrief. She signed her name, folded it, placed it in the sealed envelope tray. Sometimes accountability didn't start with the people at the top. Sometimes it started with the ones who were finally ready to admit what they didn't do. And in that momentum, there in the sky, with clouds moving past in the world below, unaware something real had started. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like Harold, like Doreen, like truth finally being told. The hum of the engines remained constant, but the energy inside the plane had shifted. Something unspoken sat between the rows like fog. The passengers were quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet that came with comfort or rest, but the heavy kind where thoughts pressed harder than words. First class wasn't relaxed anymore. It was tight with tension, with unasked questions and swallowed guilt. Harold leaned slightly to the left enough to look down the aisle. His expression was unreadable, the same steady calm he had worn when the pilot confronted him. He wasn't looking for anyone in particular. He was just absorbing, watching, remembering, processing. These were the moments that didn't make the news, that wouldn't be captured by cell phone cameras. The stillness, the long stares, the way people began to realize they had seen injustice and done nothing. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled blonde hair had finally worked up the nerve to speak. She didn't look directly at them when she did. I thought maybe there was a system glitch, she said awkwardly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to get involved if I didn't understand. Doreen didn't turn her head. That's what people always say, she murmured. They didn't know, or they weren't sure, or they didn't want to assume. The woman blushed but said nothing else. A few rows behind, Douglas was still on his phone. But this time he wasn't typing. He was reading. Already his post had gathered hundreds of replies. Most were supportive. A few were skeptical. Are you sure that's what happened? Maybe the couple caused a problem you didn't see. I find it hard to believe a pilot would just do that for no reason. Douglas sighed. He expected this. There were always people who refused to believe. Quiet racism existed. People who thought if someone wasn't shouting slurs, then maybe it wasn't so bad. People who needed the injustice to be loud to recognize it. But Douglas had seen enough now, and he had seen it quietly. He looked up and watched Harold reach into his coat and pull out a small notebook of his own, brown leather worn on the edges. He hadn't used it yet, but now he opened it and began writing in a slow, steady hand. What are you writing? Doreen asked gently. Harold didn't stop. I don't know yet. Just starting with the facts. The time. The name. What was said. You think you'll use it for something? He nodded once. Maybe, but even if I don't, I want it written down. Doreen reached for her notebook, too. In the row ahead, the man in seat 1C turned slightly. Excuse me, he said to Harold. Do you plan to sue the airline? Harold blinked. No, the man looked surprised. Really, after all that, I don't want money, Harold said. I want this airline to ask better questions. I want them to ask why a man in uniform could look at two quiet passengers sitting in their assigned seats and decide they didn't belong. Doreen added, and why a whole cabin watched it happen. The man in 1C flushed and leaned back into his seat, but he didn't argue. Near the galley, Cheryl and Allie stood facing each other again. The silence between them this time wasn't awkward. It was reflective. I filled out the report, Cheryl said quietly. Me too, Allie replied. Do you think they'll read it? Allie asked. They'll have to, Cheryl said. Especially now that passengers are talking. Once it hits the press, everything changes. Allie hesitated. Do you think, well, get in trouble? Cheryl looked tired but honest. Probably not. But that's not the point. What is the point then? The next time Cheryl said, "We don't stand there doing nothing." In the cockpit, Captain Dana Reeves clicked through her tablets, report system reviewing all communications from ground control. She had just received the final confirmation Riley's credentials were suspended indefinitely. Her eyes lingered on the line at the bottom of the report, reviewed by Executive Board status final. No further review required. She closed the screen. Jeremy glanced over. "Do you think Hell fight it?" Dana shrugged. "He can try, but I doubt Hell win." He never raised his voice, never said anything explicitly offensive. Dana turned her head. "That's not the line anymore." "Jeremy, it's not about what you say out loud, it's what you think you can do without being challenged. That's what took him down." Jeremy leaned back. "I don't think he'll forget this flight." "Good," Dana said. "You shouldn't back in first class." Harold finished his writing and closed his notebook. Doreen placed hers back into her bag. They looked at each other, not for comfort, not for answers, but just to acknowledge that they were both still present, still grounded even in the air. The truth was, they were tired, not just from this flight, but from decades of moments like this. But they had learned to carry that tiredness without bitterness, and maybe that was their greatest strength. They didn't need to yell. They didn't need to retaliate. They just needed people to finally see. And this time they had. For the first time on this plane, everyone knew who didn't belong here, and it wasn't them. The descent announcement came an hour later, but the atmosphere inside the cabin had never really relaxed. It felt as though everyone had been holding their breath, not because of turbulence or a bumpy ride, but because of the lingering weight of what they had witnessed, as the captain's calm voice echoed through the speaker system, instructing everyone to fasten seatbelts and prepare for landing. A collective shift happened. Passengers adjusted their seats, folded their trays, but the tension stayed. Harold adjusted his belt without looking away from the window. The sun was starting to set over the city below, casting a golden line across the clouds. He always loved this view. The way the sky made everything on the ground seem smaller, almost quiet. But this time it didn't feel peaceful, not after what had happened. Not after the silent complicity from the very people now pretending to read safety cards or look busy with seat adjustments. Doreen's voice broke through the hush, soft but firm. "You think they'll ever talk about this after we land?" Harold took a moment. Maybe to someone, but not in the way it happened. Not truthfully, she nodded, unsurprised. "They'll soften it, remove themselves from it. Say they weren't sure what was going on. They'll say they didn't want to get involved. That's always the excuse," she said. "Even for people in power, they wait until they're safe before they decide it mattered." In the cockpit, Captain Dana Reeves finished logging her report into the internal system. She had been methodical not just with the flight controls, but with her words. The final line in her entry read, "Flight crew failed to intervene when a racially motivated judgment removed valid passengers. In my view, the previous captain acted outside protocol, professionalism, and basic decency." She hit submit. Then she looked at Jeremy, who was pale but focused. "You ready for the landing?" He nodded. "You okay?" He looked uncertain for a moment, then he said, "I've flown with him before, never saw it like that." Dana raised an eyebrow. "Or maybe you just never had to." He didn't answer. In row 27, Cheryl checked her checklist, once again, ticking boxes with automatic precision. But she couldn't stop glancing up the aisle. Her eyes kept landing on Harold and Doreen. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she was allowed to say anything now. The moment had come and gone, and she hadn't spoken when it counted. The plane dipped slightly, starting its final descent. Seatbelt signs were on trays, locked window, shades mostly open. A usual landing, except nothing about this flight was usual anymore. In seat 1, A. Douglas took another glance at his phone. His earlier tweet had now been shared by multiple reporters. One had even replied asking for his contact. He felt conflicted, not because he regretted speaking up, but because it had taken this for him to say something at all. He was a lawyer, a man who claimed to care about rights, justice, fairness. Yet here in a moment where two innocent people had been shamed for nothing but existing in the wrong seats, he had frozen just like everyone else. He looked across the aisle at Harold and Doreen. They didn't look angry. They didn't look defeated. They just looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from a long flight, but the kind that had been building for years, decades behind them. Passengers were quietly watching too. Some replayed the moment Riley was escorted off. Some scrolled through Twitter and realized this story was already moving beyond the cabin. A few whispered to seatmates. Others stared straight ahead, pretending they didn't know they had been part of something shameful. The landing gear unfolded with a dull mechanical thud. The plane's wheels touched the runway. Seconds later, a light bounce, then the slow braking motion as the aircraft rolled toward the gate. Still no one said a word. It was the quietest landing most of them had ever experienced. As the plane pulled up to the gate and the engines began to power down, the final announcement came through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. The local time is 6:42 p.m. Please remain seated until the captain turns off the seatbelt sign and the doors are opened. Thank you for flying with us today. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but no one rushed to stand. They all looked forward toward the first-class cabin because at the front of the aircraft, the door opened and two security officers stepped in. Not loud, not harsh, just present. Passengers didn't need to ask why, they already knew. The officer in front scanned the cabin, then made eye contact with Cheryl. "We're here for a post-flight escort," he said quietly. "We've been asked to speak with a crew member who removed the passengers from their original seats before takeoff." Cheryl glanced toward the cockpit, her throat tight. "Has not here anymore." She said he was removed before departure. The officer nodded, calm but unreadable. "We were also told to follow up with the crew who witnessed the event and failed to report it in the moment." Her heart skipped. She looked back toward Allie, who stood frozen halfway down the galley. Passengers were now wide-eyed. They weren't sure if this was about justice or blame, but it didn't matter. The silence had shifted again. One officer stayed behind to speak with the flight crew. The other walked slowly down the aisle, stopping beside Harold and Doreen's. "Row you, Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins?" Harold nodded once. "Yes, I've been asked to escort you personally to the executive lounge. There's someone waiting to speak with you." Harold and Doreen stood calmly. Not a single person spoke as they collected their things. Not one person offered a hand. Not one person apologized again. But every person watched as they walked forward, just as they had earlier in the flight. The silence followed them, but this time it didn't feel like erasure. It felt like recognition. They didn't smile. They didn't nod. They simply walked with dignity, with presence, with the weight of every quiet injustice they had ever carried, and everyone they no longer would. The glass doors of the executive lounge slid open with a soft whoosh. Inside, the lighting was warm and quiet, the kind that tried to make people forget they were still in an airport. Plush chairs lined the perimeter, sleek modern tables sat untouched, and the faint scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Harold and Doreen stepped in their carry-on, trailing silently behind them. The officer who had escorted them paused just inside the entrance and nodded toward the far end of the room. "Hez waiting for you, just over there." Harold followed the officer's gesture. Sitting at the corner table was a man in a crisp charcoal suit, silver at his temples, and a face that looked both composed and exhausted. He stood the moment they approached and extended a hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. My name is Mark Ridley, Executive Vice President of Operations for the airline. I want to start by saying I'm deeply sorry for what happened today." Doreen looked at the offered hand but didn't take it right away. She stared at him for a long second, then finally shook it. Harold followed with a firm grip, then gestured toward the seats. They all sat. Mark cleared his throat and adjusted his tie, though it didn't need adjusting. It was the kind of motion people made when they were trying to hold control. "I won't insult your time by pretending this was a misunderstanding." He began. "Captain Riley acted inappropriately and unprofessionally. He didn't verify your boarding passes. He made a judgment based solely on appearance." "And worse, no one stopped him?" Doreen raised an eyebrow. "No one," she repeated, not as a question, but as a fact. Mark nodded. "We've already reviewed security footage, internal crew messages, and passenger reports. The response from our side failed on every level, from the moment you boarded to the moment you were escorted back to your seats. And if my daughter hadn't made a phone call," Harold asked, "what would have happened?" Then Mark paused. You would have spent the entire flight in coach. We wouldn't have known. There would be no investigation. Doreen leaned forward slightly. So you're not sorry for what happened. You're sorry you got caught. Mark swallowed him sorry for both and am prepared to take real action. He reached into his leather folder and placed a printed document on the table. This is a written acknowledgement from our board. Captain Riley's credentials have been permanently revoked. He will not fly for you or any of our partner airlines again. His actions today were a violation of protocol and our core conduct standards. Harold didn't even reach for the paper. That's a start, he said, but that's not the root of the issue. Mark nodded again, slower this time. We know that, which is why I'm also here to ask for your input, not just to patch things up, but to implement real changes. We're launching a full review of our internal bias response training. We want to expand it beyond entry-level flight crews and include senior staff captains and even our executive team. Doreen's gaze sharpened. You want us to help build the system that trains the people who ignored us. Mark didn't flinch. Yes, for a moment, neither Harold nor Doreen said anything. Then Harold asked, do you think one training session will fix this? No, Mark admitted, but we have to begin somewhere. And the only way we can begin right is by listening to the people we failed. Doreen finally reached for the document and scanned it. Will this become public? Yes, he said, we're issuing a statement within 24 hours, but we wanted to speak with you first. Privately, Harold looked him in the eye. People are going to say we're overreacting, that it wasn't that serious, that we're playing a race card. Mark nodded. They already are, but we've made the decision to move forward anyway. Doreen leaned back in her seat. And what about the crew, the ones who stood by and said nothing? There will be reviews, he said, some disciplinary, some corrective, but all mandatory. Silence settled between them again, a long, thick moment where time stretched and the air felt heavy with what couldn't be unsaid. Then Doreen asked the question no one had yet spoken aloud. Why did it take our last name to make this matter? Mark looked up slowly, because sometimes change doesn't come from outrage, it comes from shame. And today a lot of people, including me, were forced to look in a mirror they'd been avoiding. Harold nodded slowly. That's the thing about shame. It doesn't go away when the news cycle ends, it stays. Mark stood wed like to offer you a formal apology publicly. At your discretion, Doreen looked at Harold and they exchanged a wordless conversation and a glance. Then she said, well, think about it. Mark stepped away, leaving them alone with the offer, the document, and the knowledge that, for once, people in power had listened. But Doreen didn't feel victorious, and neither did Harold, because they both knew this wasn't the end. It was just the part where the world pretended it had learned something, and they'd lived long enough to know learning didn't mean changing, but it was at least a beginning. The lounge emptied gradually. A few suited travelers passed through, glancing at Harold and Doreen with quiet curiosity before moving on. The clatter of ice in glasses and the hum of hushed conversations faded. The overhead lights dimmed slightly, signaling the slow transition from day to night. Harold sat still, one hand resting on the document. Mark Ridley had left. Doreen hadn't spoken since he walked away. She was watching the glass wall of the lounge, where the tarmac stretched beyond rows of blinking lights and distant planes, moving like shadows across a stage. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. The kind of silence that followed a storm, not because the weather had cleared, but because the damage had already been done. Harold finally exhaled through his nose and tapped the folder. Once you believe him, he asked softly. Doreen didn't look away from the window. I believe he meant it in the moment. I believe he's embarrassed. Shame doesn't last. Harold muttered. No, she said, but it stains. She turned toward him, her eyes sharp but calm. We've seen people cry before remember, apologize, pledge change. And 2 months later, they're shaking hands with the next person who makes the same mistake. Harold nodded slowly. So what do we do with this? Doreen reached into her purse, pulled out her notebook again, and flipped to a blank page. We write. We document. We remember not for them, for us, so that if they try to rewrite what happened, we've already written it down. She jotted a few words, then paused. Elena will want to know everything, Harold said. Doreen smiled faintly. She'll read it in my handwriting before she hears it in my voice. Their daughter had been silent for the last hour, likely sitting at her desk, watching the situation unfold through social media and email threads. Elena wasn't dramatic. She didn't chase headlines, but she was sharp, calculated, and fiercely protective of the two people who had raised her with grace, despite a world that didn't always offer it. A ping broke the silence. Harold glanced at his phone. Another message from Elena, Mom, Dad. There's a journalist from the Times trying to reach you. She says she wants to talk, not about what happened, but about how you responded. Harold showed the screen to Doreen. She read it once. Then again, I'm tired. She said, I know, he replied. So am I, but we don't get to be tired. Yet she added, not while they still think a silence is enough. Harold considered that. He leaned back. Letting her words settle, I'm not interested in a headline, he said. But maybe it's time they heard the story from the people who lived it. Another moment passed. Then Doreen picked up the folder again. She flipped through it slowly, carefully. Her fingers paused at the signature page, the one with Ridley's name printed neatly beneath a line that said, Accountability begins here. She scoffed softly. He thinks this is the beginning, she said. But we've been carrying this since before we could vote. This is just the part they finally noticed. Harold nodded. They think today was unusual. It wasn't, Doreen said, it was Tuesday. It was every Tuesday we've lived through. Harold placed a hand on hers gently. She didn't move away. You think we should talk to the reporter? He asked. I think she said we talk to whoever is willing to actually listen, but not to perform. Not for clicks. We don't owe anyone a performance. No, Harold said. But we owe Elena the truth so she can carry it clean. They sat together watching as ground crew moved in the distance, unseen to the rest of the airport. The world outside the glass kept turning. Planes landed, passengers rushed, people checked bags and hurried to destinations with no idea that just a few yards away, a story had unfolded that would never make the headlines in full. Only fragments, only retellings. The full weight of it would never fit in a tweet, because this wasn't just about a seat. It wasn't just about a pilot. It wasn't even about a single airline or a single mistake. It was about the long, exhausting history of having to prove you belong somewhere. You already earned your place, and Harold stood, stretched his back, and looked down at his wife. We'll talk to the reporter, he said, but on our terms, not theirs. Doreen smiled faintly. Always on our terms. They gathered their things slowly. No one rushed them, no one interrupted. And as they left the lounge together, shoulders square, pace, even faces calm, there was no applause, no flash, no dramatic music, just two people walking forward again. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Because silence had always come easily to others. But for them, truth had to be earned and carried every step of the way. The hallway outside the lounge was lined with glass on one side, offering a panoramic view of the tarmac. The airport buzzed beyond, families reuniting, announcements echoing through the speakers, the usual symphony of rolling luggage, boarding calls, and gate changes. But for Harold and Doreen, everything felt a beat slower. Their steps were deliberate, each stride a quiet statement. They didn't speak for a while. Both of them were still absorbing the weight of everything: the pilot's dismissal, the executive's apology, the lounge conversation, Elena's messages. Too much had happened in too short a time, and yet in many ways nothing about it felt new. It felt like walking through an old storm, only this time with cameras watching. At the escalator, Doreen finally broke the silence. You remember what my grandmother used to say? She asked without turning her head. Harold smiled faintly. Which time? When she used to talk about her bus seat, the one she refused to give up. He nodded slowly. She said, They wanted me to move because they were uncomfortable, but I stayed because I was tired. Doreen's voice softened. I never really understood it until now. They reached the bottom of the escalator and stepped onto the marble floor of the main terminal. A few travelers recognized them from the flight passengers who had sat nearby, who had watched everything unfold but said nothing. Now some offered polite nods, others looked away. One young man, maybe in his 20s, stepped forward tentatively. I just wanted to say I saw what happened. And I'm sorry, he said, his voice almost nervous. Harold studied him. His shoes were worn and his backpack was fraying at the edges, but his eyes were steady. "Thank you," Harold replied simply. The young man hesitated. "I didn't say anything on the flight. I should have, I just didn't know what to do." Doreen looked him in the eye. "Next time, say something, I will." He promised. They walked on. Elena was waiting for them at the private car pickup area. She wore a long navy coat and had her hair pulled back into a low bun. Her expression was composed, but the tightness in her jaw gave her away. She wrapped her arms around her parents as soon as they approached. "You okay?" she asked, pulling back. Harold smiled tiredly. Still standing, Elena glanced behind them, scanning the terminal. "They really removed him," "Yes," Doreen said. "And then they gave us water, apologies, and paperwork." Elena folded her arms. "They want this buried, quiet resolution? Nice sound bites? They gave us a platform," Harold said, "didn't ask us to sign anything?" "Not yet." Elena pulled out her phone. "I've already had 3 journalists email me. I've saved everything. Screenshots, statements, even the tweets from other passengers. We can shape this narrative how we want. No one else." Doreen placed a hand on her daughter's wrist gently. "We're not looking to punish. We're looking to prevent." "I know," Elena said. "But prevention only happens when the truth gets loud." They stepped into the waiting car. The driver, a man in his 50s, with kind eyes, nodded and offered them bottles of water. Harold noticed the name on the placard, clipped to the dashboard. Walter F. As they pulled away from the terminal, the city skyline stretched ahead, glowing amber and gold in the setting sun. The radio was turned low, just the faint sound of strings from a classical station. Elena turned to face them from the front seat. "There's going to be backlash," she said. "Online, maybe in the press. They'll say you exaggerated. Some will say you made it up." Harold didn't flinch. "They always do. They'll call it a miscommunication, maybe say Riley had a bad day." Doreen let out a breath. "And well, say we had a bad life. See who listens longer." Elena looked out the window. "We don't have to go public with everything, but I want to put pressure in the right places, quietly, strategically." "You're your mother's daughter," Harold said with a grin. Elena smiled, then grew serious again. "There's one more thing." She pulled out a printed email. "I contacted a civil rights foundation. They want to speak with you both. Not for a lawsuit, for a teaching panel. They host trainings for law enforcement, corporate executives, airline leadership. They think your story could anchor a new course." Doreen raised an eyebrow. "They want us to teach them how to treat people like humans." Elena hesitated. "They want your lived truth, not the headline version. The whole story." The car slowed at a red light. Outside, the sidewalk bustled with life. A couple laughed near a food cart. A businessman shouted into his Bluetooth. A teenager danced while recording a video. The world kept spinning, and yet inside the car, time held still. Harold took the email, read it, then folded it neatly. "You think they'll really listen?" "They have to," Elena replied. "Or they'll end up on the same list as that pilot." Doreen looked out the window again. "Funny," she said softly. "We took a trip to relax, and now we're being asked to fix a system." Harold reached for her hand. "We're not fixing the system, we're holding the mirror." And sometimes that was the most dangerous thing you could do, because mirrors don't change what's there. They just make it impossible to ignore. 2 days later, the story had moved faster than any of them expected. It began with a single tweet. Douglas Merrow's post, just a few lines, simple but sharp. That post alone was shared over 40,000 times in less than 24 hours. Major news outlets picked it up, cable networks ran quick segments. But it wasn't until a blurry cell phone video surfaced that everything changed. The clip was less than a minute long. It began with the sound of Captain Riley's voice, calm but firm, ordering Harold and Doreen to leave their seats in first class. The video shook slightly as the passenger filming tried to hold their phone low. You could hear Doreen saying, "We have boarding passes," and Harold's steady reply, "We paid for these seats." Then came Riley's cold response. "You don't match the profile, you need to move." No shouting, no profanity, just a man in uniform saying something that echoed like a quiet explosion. The video cut off as they were led away by a silent Cheryl in a nervous alley. The silence from the rest of the cabin spoke louder than any words. Within hours, the footage appeared on every major platform. Hashtag spread. Not your profile flight 4673. They belonged there. Talk shows debated it. Podcasts dissected it. Celebrities retweeted it. Some asked how something like this could still happen. Others, especially from older Black communities, shook their heads and said, "It always has." Back at home, Harold and Doreen watched the coverage from their living room. Their house was modest, quiet walls, warm, lighting the smell of old books and tea lingering in the corners. Elena sat on the couch with her laptop, open messages flooding her inbox from reporters, lawyers, publicists, and advocacy organizations. Doreen muted the television. "It's strange," she said, "watching people talk about your pain, like it's a plot line." Harold gave a tired chuckle. "Today's outrage, tomorrow's scroll." Elena looked up. "That's why we control the next move. Not just for you, but for everyone who's watching this and thinking, that could have been me." Doreen stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the neighbor's kid was playing with a ball running up and down the sidewalk, laughter echoing in bursts. The world outside hadn't changed, but inside, something had shifted. A knock on the door interrupted the moment. It was a courier formal professional briefcase in hand. He handed Elena a sealed envelope with the airline's logo. She thanked him, closed the door, and opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a formal invitation to speak at a corporate summit hosted by the airline's parent company. The summit was meant to address systemic inequity across all departments, shiring, crew dynamics, passenger protocol. The board wanted Harold and Doreen not as guests, but as advisors. "They want to make it right," Elena said, scanning the letter. "Or they want to be seen trying." Harold took the letter. "You think it's genuine parts of it," she said. "The rest is fear." This got bigger than they planned. Doreen returned to the table and glanced at the letter, then folded it. "We'll go," she said quietly, "but we're not there to make them feel comfortable." Elena nodded. "We shouldn't be." That evening, their phones didn't stop buzzing. A young student from Chicago sent a message. "My parents were kicked out of business class 2 years ago. No one believed them. Thank you for making them feel seen." Another message came from an elderly woman in Atlanta. 78, "I've seen too much. But when I saw you walk back to your seat on that plane, I cried. Because you didn't shrink, you stood taller." They received over 100 similar messages that night alone. Stories of silence, of quiet humiliation, of moments forgotten by the world, but burned into people's memory. Doreen replied to a few. Harold read everyone. "Maybe it's not about us anymore," he said, closing his phone. "Maybe it never was." "No," Doreen agreed. "It's about all the times this happened without a camera, without a headline, without anyone being believed." And now Elena asked. "Now," Harold said, "we speak for the people who never got a second look, let alone a second chance." The following day, the three of them arrived at the airline's headquarters. They walked past glass walls and polished floors through corridors filled with executives in designer suits. Some looked down, others nodded awkwardly. They were escorted into a boardroom with a long oak table and 12 men and women seated in silence. The room had the energy of people trying to look confident, but fearing what was about to happen. Mark Ridley was already there. He gestured toward the seats and said, "Thank you for coming." Doreen didn't smile, she sat. So did Harold. Elena remained standing, placing a folder on the table. "We're not here for show," Elena said. "We're here for terms." The air grew still. Harold leaned forward. "First term. This doesn't get buried once the news cycle ends. You build a program, not a presentation." Doreen added. "Second, you include us in the decision-making process, not just as representatives, but as witnesses to a system you ignored for too long." Elena opened the folder. "Third, you allocate funds, not hush money investment, in training and hiring and community listening sessions. You put your profits where your apologies are." The board members exchanged looks. One man tried to clear his throat and speak, but Ridley raised his hand. "We accept the terms," he said, "with one addition, that this isn't a one-time engagement, that you stay involved for the long run." Doreen leaned back. "That depends on what?" asked a woman at the table. "On whether this company has finally learned the difference between reaction and responsibility." Harold nodded. Because we've seen too many people react. Few take responsibility. The boardroom fell silent again, but this time it wasn't avoidance. It was recognition, and for the first time in a long time, Harold and Doreen didn't feel like they had to prove their presence. They already owned it. A month later, the ripple hadn't faded. What began on Flight 4673 wasn't just a scandal, it became a case study, a conversation, a movement. The airline published a full report detailing not just what happened, but what failed. Riley's license was officially revoked and blacklisted across all major carriers. But more importantly, the silence that had once protected people like him had cracked. Harold and Doreen never asked for media tours, but their story had become something others clung to. Not because they were celebrities, but because they were familiar. Their faces looked like someone's parents. Their dignity reminded people of someone they loved. Their silence, their calm, their refusal to be erased. It had given voice to thousands who had spent their lives wondering if anyone would ever see them fully. They didn't do interviews for drama. They didn't speak in outrage. They spoke from experience. That's what made people listen at a university in North Carolina. A new ethics course added a module titled The Quiet Fight, Respect Bias, and Institutional Response in Modern Travel. The first video in the unit showed Harold and Doreen speaking to airline executives, not in anger, but in clarity. It showed the moment Doreen said, "We're not your first story. We're just the one that got filmed." At a crew training facility in Arizona, a simulated passenger scenario was updated. A flight attendant was instructed to assess seating complaints, but the new guidelines included one highlighted line in bold: always question your own bias before questioning someone's belonging. Meanwhile, at home, things didn't change much for Harold and Doreen. They still made tea in the afternoons, still took walks around their neighborhood, still read the paper in the mornings and argued over the crossword. But now when they walked into place, airports, restaurants, hotel lobbies, there was a shift. Not from everyone, but from enough people to notice. One evening, they received a letter in the mail handwritten. The envelope was postmarked from Texas. Inside was a note. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins, I'm a retired pilot. I flew for over 35 years. I never spoke up when I saw things I should. Your story has haunted me. In the best way, I finally reached out to a young black pilot at my former airline and told him I had failed him years ago. He said he already forgave me, but I needed to say it. Thank you, Dan. Harold read the letter out loud, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with the others. They had received dozens like it, some from strangers, some from neighbors, even one from a member of the crew who had served silently during that flight and now wanted to apologize years too late. Doreen sat across from him, sipping her chamomile tea. You think they'll forget again? She asked. Most will, Harold said. But some won't. Some will remember next time. That's all we ever asked. She replied that the next time someone stands up before it's too late. The doorbell rang. It was Elena holding a folder under one arm and a pie in the other. They've drafted the community teaching guide, she said, stepping in and kissing Doreen on the cheek. They want your notes on the language. They'll get them. Harold smiled. We already marked a few things last night. Doreen took the pie. You think people are actually learning, baby? Elena paused at the doorway before heading into the kitchen. No, I think they're being made to listen. That's the first step. That night, the three of them sat in the living room. No lights except the soft glow from the lamp by the window. A record played in the corner, old jazz, smooth and low. Doreen rested her head on Harold's shoulder. Elena sat curled in the armchair, pen in hand, editing the training script. Outside, the world carried on. Planes still flew. People still boarded. Stories still unfolded. Some good, some cruel, some unseen. But this story, it had been seen. It had been told truthfully. It had mattered, and that was enough. Not because justice had been served in full, but because dignity had remained untouched, because grace had refused to shrink, because two ordinary people had stood tall in a place meant to make them small, and the world could no longer pretend it hadn't watched them rise. This wasn't just a story about a racist pilot. It was about quiet power, silent witnesses, and what happens when dignity refuses to back down. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real, powerful stories like this one.